The poor widow sheltered a strange, never imagining she was housing the true heir to the throne. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The wind howled down the glen like a wounded beast, shaking the shutters of the small stone cottage where Margaret MacLeod tried to mend her son's torn cloak. The fire had gone low, and every few minutes she stirred it with a trembling hand, feeding it scraps of wood she'd gathered that afternoon. Ian, barely 6, slept by the hearth, his cheeks flushed from the cold. Outside, the highlands were buried under a storm of sleet and snow, and the valley had gone silent, too silent. Then came the knock. 3 heavy blows against the door, each louder than the last. Margaret froze, her heart racing. No one came this far up the valley at night. She looked at her sleeping son, then at the iron poker by the fire. Another knock, weaker this time. A man's voice called out, rough and strained, "Please, open, I beg you." She hesitated, then reached for the latch. The wind burst in as she opened the door, carrying snow and darkness with it. A man stumbled forward, soaked through, a torn cloak clinging to his shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes fever bright. He fell to one knee. "Forgive me," he gasped. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I just need shelter, one night." Margaret's instincts warred with her fear. Every villager had heard tales of raiders, of deserters, of thieves roaming the hills, but there was something in his voice, an exhaustion too deep to fake. "Who are you?" she asked. "Thomas," he said after a pause. "Just Thomas." He tried to stand but nearly collapsed. Margaret stepped forward before she could think, catching his arm. The fabric of his coat was soaked, heavy with ice. Beneath it she felt the tremor of pain. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing. I'll sleep in your barn if you'll allow it." She shook her head. "You won't last the night in that barn. Come inside." Quietly, he looked at her in disbelief. "You'd trust a stranger?" "I trust that you're too weak to harm me," she replied, leading him toward the hearth. Thomas sank beside the fire, shivering as the warmth reached him. Margaret hung his cloak near the flames, poured him a cup of thin broth and watched as he drank slowly, his hands trembling. "Thank you," he murmured. "I thought I'd freeze out there." She didn't answer. She couldn't stop studying him. The clean line of his jaw, the dark hair matted with snow, the faint accent that didn't belong to these hills. His clothes, though torn, were fine. The boots alone were worth more than her month's income. Ian stirred and blinked sleepily. "Mama, who's that?" "A traveler," she said. "Go back to sleep." The boy looked at the man curiously, then lay down again. Thomas watched him, a softness in his expression that surprised her. "You live here alone?" he asked quietly. "With my son," she said. "My husband died at Culloden." He bowed his head. "Then you've known loss." Margaret felt a flicker of defensiveness. Everyone in this valley has. Silence fell again, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the wind outside. Thomas's eyes drifted shut, and within moments he was asleep. Margaret covered him with a blanket, unsure why she felt compelled to. When she finally sat down, exhaustion settled in. What kind of man wandered the moors in a storm like this? A fugitive? A soldier? A madman? She told herself she would let him rest until dawn and send him on his way. But sleep would not come. Hours later the storm eased. The cottage was dim and quiet. Margaret rose to check on her guest. He slept deeply, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. She bent to gather his wet cloak from the floor, and something heavy slipped from its folds. It clattered softly onto the stones. She froze. It was a small golden emblem, shaped like a lion rampant, the mark of Scotland's royal line. The edges were stained dark, as if with dried blood. Her pulse quickened. Only nobles carried such a symbol. What was it doing in the possession of a man half dead in the snow? Margaret knelt, staring at the emblem in the firelight. She thought of the rumors whispered at market, the talk of uprisings, of a royal heir lost after the last rebellion, of bounty hunters combing the highlands for a man who bore the mark of the crown. The thought chilled her more than the storm. She looked at Thomas again. His face, now peaceful in sleep, carried no trace of arrogance. But there was something, an old grief etched deep. He stirred suddenly, murmuring in his dream. "No more blood," he whispered. "No more crowns." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Ian shifted in his sleep, but didn't wake. She set the emblem on the table and wrapped it in a cloth. Tomorrow she'd decide what to do. Perhaps she'd confront him, demand the truth. Or perhaps she'd throw it into the river and forget. She didn't notice that he had woken. Thomas's eyes opened slowly, focusing on her in the half-light. "You're still awake," he said softly. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, turning away. "Storms kept me restless." He nodded, though something in her voice made his brow furrow. "You've been kind to me, Mrs. MacLeod. More than I deserve. I did what anyone would." "No," he said. Most would have closed the door. Margaret didn't answer. She added a log to the fire, watching the sparks rise. "Rest now. You'll need your strength to travel tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he echoed, his gaze unreadable. "Yes, if the snow allows it." When morning came, the world outside lay white and still. The storm had passed, leaving a silence so deep it felt sacred. Margaret dressed quietly, set water to boil and stepped outside to fetch more wood. The air stung her lungs. She looked across the valley and saw no tracks but her own. No sign of life, no sound. Only the weight of snow pressing against the world. When she returned, Thomas was awake, sitting by the fire. He had cleaned his wound, a shallow cut on his shoulder, and was trying to lace his torn coat. "You shouldn't be moving yet," she said. "I've rested too long," he replied. "I can't trouble you another day. You'd die out there, the passes are frozen." He smiled faintly. "I've faced worse." "Then you're a fool," she muttered. "Likely," he said, amused. The boy Ian appeared, rubbing his eyes. "Is the storm gone?" "For now," Margaret said, helping him with his boots. Thomas watched them quietly. When the child ran outside to play in the snow, he turned to her. "You're brave to live here alone." "Bravery's not what keeps us alive," she said. "It's necessity." He tilted his head. "You speak like someone who's seen more than this valley. I've seen enough to know that words don't fill bellies." He looked away, thoughtful. "Still, kindness fills something else." Margaret felt her cheeks warm but said nothing. As the day wore on, Thomas helped her mend the fence, insisting despite his wound. His hands were sure, practiced, not like a farmer's, but a man accustomed to command. He moved with a quiet discipline, even in pain. At midday they shared bread and broth. Ian chattered happily about his lost lamb, about snow spirits and brave kings who would one day return. Margaret tried to hush him, but Thomas only smiled, listening as though the boy's tales meant something sacred. When the sun began to sink, he stood by the doorway, staring out across the hills. "Strange," he murmured. "How silence can be louder than battle." Margaret joined him. "You've been in battles, then?" He hesitated. "Too many." "And did you win?" He gave a bitter smile. "No one wins those." That night, after they ate, Margaret put Ian to bed and sat by the hearth. Thomas sat across from her, his face lit by firelight. "You'll leave at dawn?" she asked. "If I must." "You must. The villagers will talk if they see a strange man here." "I understand." He reached for his cloak, and for a moment she thought he might find the missing emblem. But he didn't. Instead, he drew out a piece of cloth, an old crest, embroidered with the same lion rampant she'd seen in gold. Margaret's breath caught. "That symbol," she said. "It's royal." Thomas looked at it, then folded it carefully. "It's a memory," he said simply. "Of what?" "Of a country that forgot its heart." She didn't know how to answer. His eyes met hers, steady and sad. "Mrs. MacLeod," he said quietly, "if the soldiers come, you must not tell them you've seen me." "Why? Who are you?" He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "No one worth remembering." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to send him away and forget this night ever happened. But something deep inside told her that fate had crossed her path with his for a reason. When the fire burned low, she rose to fetch another log, and her hand brushed the bundle on the table, the one that hid the golden emblem. For a heartbeat, she thought of asking him about it. Then she saw how weary he looked, how fragile. She turned away. Outside, snow began to fall again, thin and silent. Margaret lay awake for hours, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing. It was strange, she thought, how easily a stranger's presence could make a house feel alive again. As dawn touched the hills, she rose to prepare breakfast. Light crept into the cottage, pale and cold. She turned toward the hearth and stopped. Thomas slept deeply, his hand resting near his torn cloak. And there, half hidden beneath the folds, gleamed the same golden insignia she'd found the night before, faintly catching the light. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She lifted it carefully, holding it to the window. The lion's eyes seemed to glint with fire. She realized then that she had not given fate shelter. It had walked through her door and lain beside her fire. Margaret didn't move. The emblem glowed faintly in the grey morning light, catching on the edges of her fingers. It was beautiful, even with the dried stain that looked too much like blood. She set it down on the table, her thoughts running wild. No ordinary man carried a crest like that. Behind her, Thomas stirred. She slipped the emblem into her apron pocket before he could see. When he finally looked up, she met his eyes with a calmness she didn't feel. "You're awake," she said. "Long enough to know you don't sleep much," he replied, smiling faintly. "You were standing there half the night." "The storm was loud," she said quickly, "and you were feverish." He nodded, pulling himself to his feet. "It's better now. You've done more than I deserved." "You still can't travel," she said. "The paths will be frozen." Thomas studied her face for a moment, as if searching for something he couldn't name. "You're not afraid of me," he said finally. "I've seen worse than a half-frozen traveler," she answered. "But tell me, where were you headed?" "North," he said after a pause. "Always north." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give." Ian burst through the door, his cheeks red from the cold. "Mama, there's a fire down in the valley. Maybe the inn's chimney caught again." Thomas froze. His expression shifted so quickly she almost missed it. Fear, recognition, something darker. "How many fires?" he asked sharply. Ian blinked. "Just one, I think." "Why?" Thomas grabbed his cloak and looked toward the window. "That's not an inn fire," he muttered. "They're burning something. Who would—" "Soldiers," he said, cutting her off. "They're close." Margaret stared at him. "How would you know that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to her, his face pale. "If they come this way, you mustn't let them in. You tell them nothing." She crossed her arms. "You seem to expect trouble everywhere you go." "Because it follows me," he said. There was a long silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind at the windows. Margaret glanced at her son, who was still watching them, confused. "Go fetch more wood, Ian," she said, "and stay close." When he was gone, she turned back to Thomas. "You need to tell me who's after you." He hesitated, then shook his head. "If I do, you'll wish I hadn't come." "That's not an answer either," she said, her patience thinning. Before he could reply, hooves echoed down the valley road, slow at first, then louder, a steady rhythm of iron against ice. Margaret's heart lurched. Thomas looked toward the door, every muscle tense. "Are they yours?" she whispered. "They belong to no one I call friend," he said grimly. "Hide me. I have a child here." "I know. Please." Something in his voice, urgent, desperate, but never commanding, pushed her past hesitation. She pointed to the trap door beneath the rug. "There's a storage pit under the floor. Go." Thomas didn't waste time. He slipped inside and she dragged a wooden chest over the rug. Ian came running back, his arms full of firewood. "Who's coming, Mama?" "No one," she said quickly. "Just travelers passing by." But they weren't passing by. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside the door. A sharp knock followed. Margaret swallowed hard and opened it. 3 men stood there, cloaked in the king's colours, their horses steaming in the cold. The tallest of them, clearly the captain, gave her a look that made her skin crawl. "Margaret MacLeod?" he asked. "Yes," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "We're searching for a fugitive. A man in his 30s, dark hair, wounded arm. He's wanted by the Crown for treason." "Treason," she repeated, feigning surprise. "Have you seen anyone matching that description?" She shook her head. "No one travels this far in weather like this." The captain's eyes swept the room, sharp and cold. "Mind if we look around? You won't find anything. That's for me to decide." He stepped inside without waiting. His men followed, stomping snow onto her floor. They tore open her cupboards, poked through baskets, even lifted the rug, just not far enough to reveal the trapdoor. Margaret's stomach twisted. Ian clung to her skirt, trembling. One of the soldiers smirked at the boy. "What's the matter, lad? Seen ghosts?" "He's shy," Margaret said quickly. The captain turned back to her. "Strange," he said, glancing at the half-dried cloak hanging by the fire. "You said you were alone, yet there's a man's coat here." She froze. "It was my husband's." "Your husband's been dead 5 years," he said. "Everyone in the valley knows that." Her mouth went dry. "Then it's just an old thing I keep. You can ask the pastor." He stepped closer. "I could, but I don't care for priests. They lie for the sake of mercy." "Then you're better suited to cruelty," she said quietly. His eyes narrowed. "Watch your tongue, widow." He turned and gestured for his men to continue searching. One of them kicked at the woodpile. Another pried open her small chest of linens. Margaret stood motionless, her hands clasped so tightly they ached. At last, the captain stopped. "Nothing," he said, sounding disappointed. "If you do see the man, report to the garrison. There's a reward." "I have no need for silver," she said. He smiled without warmth. "Everyone has need for something." He looked at her one last time, then at the child, and finally at the fire. "Be careful who you feed, Mrs. MacLeod. Strangers carry storms in their shadows." When the door shut behind them, she sagged against it, her knees weak. The sound of hooves faded down the valley. She waited a full minute before pulling the rug aside. The trap door creaked open, and Thomas climbed out, his face drawn and pale. "You heard them," she said. "I did," he replied. "You risked everything for me." "I should have turned you over," she snapped, her fear turning to anger. "They would have spared the house, my boy." He looked at her quietly. "You didn't." "Why are they after you?" she demanded. "Tell me the truth." He hesitated, then sank onto the bench, exhaustion overtaking him. "Because I was born into a name I didn't ask for." "That's not an answer." "It's all I can give," he said softly. Margaret stared at him, torn between fury and pity. Ian crept closer, looking up at Thomas with wide eyes. "Did you really do bad things?" he asked. Thomas's lips twitched. "Worse than eating the last loaf of bread?" The boy shook his head. "No one's worse than that." A flicker of laughter broke through the tension. Margaret exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. "You can't stay here," she said. "If they come back—" "They will," he said. "But not tonight. Soldiers rarely brave the cold twice in a day." "Then tomorrow you go," she said. He nodded. "If the road allows it." The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Margaret went about her chores, trying to ignore the presence of the emblem hidden in her pocket. Every time she felt its weight, she thought of the captain's eyes, the way he'd looked at her house, as though it already belonged to him. By evening, Thomas helped her repair the broken latch on the door. Ian watched, asking endless questions about swords and castles, which Thomas deflected with patient humor. For a brief hour, the fear in the room seemed to fade. When the boy went to bed, Margaret stood at the window, watching snow drift past the glass. "If you leave tomorrow," she said, "you'll die before you reach the next village." "Then I'll die free," he said. "You speak like a man who's already given up." He met her gaze. "And you speak like someone who hasn't learned how." She turned away. "Don't be poetic. It doesn't suit a fugitive, nor a widow," he said softly. She looked back at him, startled by the gentleness in his tone. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled between them. Finally, she said, "If you ever want to repay me, tell me your real name." He shook his head slowly. "If I do that, you'll never look at me the same." She frowned. "And if I don't ask, then you might still believe I'm worth trusting." The way he said it made something twist in her chest. She crossed her arms and turned toward the stairs. "Sleep while you can. You'll need strength to run again." When she reached the landing, the wind outside picked up, moaning across the roof. She glanced back once. Thomas sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they held the ghosts of his past. She went to bed, but sleep was shallow and filled with restless dreams. In them she saw soldiers marching through the snow, a golden lion burning bright against the dark, and a man's face half hidden by smoke. At dawn, a knock came, not sharp, not violent, but urgent. Margaret sat up, her heart leaping. Thomas was already awake below. She could hear him move. She hurried down the stairs. "Stay out of sight," she whispered. He nodded and vanished behind the storeroom door. The knock came again, louder this time. She opened the door halfway and nearly dropped the latch. A villager stood there, breathless and pale. "Margaret," he gasped, They're searching again. The king's soldiers are combing the valley. They're questioning every home. Her hands went cold. Why? They say the fugitive's close. They'll be here by nightfall. She thanked him and closed the door. Thomas stepped out from the shadows. They've found my trail, he said quietly. Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding. Then tell me what I'm hiding under my roof. He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering across his face. A man who once had everything, he said finally, and now has only a secret. Then it's killing both of us, she whispered. Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but the sudden sound of distant horns cut through the morning air. Margaret turned toward the window, her breath catching. Dark shapes moved through the fog below the ridge, their banners faint in the mist. The soldiers had reached the valley. The horns echoed across the valley, carried by the wind like a warning. Margaret stood frozen by the window, her breath fogging the glass. Below the ridge, she saw riders moving through the mist, dark figures cutting across the snow. Thomas stepped closer. They're coming faster than I thought. How many? Enough, he said. They'll search every house again. Margaret turned from the window. You can't stay here. There's nowhere else to go, he said quietly. They'll block the roads before nightfall. Then we'll hide you again, she said, her voice firm. This house kept you safe once. He shook his head. They'll tear it apart this time. Before she could argue, Ian came rushing down the stairs, clutching his wooden toy horse. Mama, what's happening? Are the soldiers back? She forced a smile. Nothing to fear, love. Go to the loft and stay there. Don't come down until I say. The boy's eyes filled with confusion, but... Now Ian, he obeyed, his small feet pattering up the steps. The moment he was gone, Margaret turned back to Thomas. If they find you, they'll take me too. I won't let that happen, he said. Then move, she snapped, pulling at his arm. There's space beneath the floorboards in the barn. It's dark, but it'll do. Thomas followed without protest. The wind cut at them as they crossed the yard, their boots sinking into the snow. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and cold earth mixed in the air. She pulled up a loose plank and pointed. Down there. He hesitated, meeting her eyes. You don't owe me this. Don't waste time, she said. Go. He climbed down, crouching low. Margaret lowered the plank and spread hay across it, her hands trembling. Just as she finished, she heard the sound of hooves again, closer now, crunching over the frozen ground. She rushed back to the cottage, forcing calm into her steps. Moments later, the captain from before appeared at her door, his breath fogging in the cold. You again, he said. I warned you about strangers, and I told you there are none here, she replied, her tone even. He smiled, a thin, cruel smile. Funny thing, the soldiers we posted at the river saw tracks leading toward this valley. 2 sets, one large, one small. I wonder where they went. Tracks disappear in snow, she said. True, he said, stepping inside. But your fire's burning bright and there's meat cooking. A bit generous for a woman who lives alone, don't you think? I cook for my son. Then where is he? Upstairs asleep. He tilted his head. We'll see about that. He gestured to his men. Search again. They moved through the cottage with heavy boots, knocking things over, pulling open drawers. One of them found the extra pair of boots by the hearth. He lifted them up and grinned. Too big for a child, Captain. Margaret's stomach twisted. They belong to my husband, she said quickly. Your husband's boots were buried with him, the captain said, his voice low. I remember. She stared back, refusing to flinch. Then you remember too much for your own good. He laughed. You've got spirit, I almost admire it. His men continued searching, spilling flour from the pantry and overturning her table. Ian's voice called softly from above. Mama? Stay there, she called, her tone sharper than she meant. The captain looked up toward the loft. Seems the boy's awake. Children are honest creatures. Maybe he'll tell us if he's seen anyone. Margaret stepped in front of the stairs. He's frightened. You won't go near him. The captain's smile vanished. You forget your place, widow. He moved closer, but she didn't back away. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of wind outside. Finally, he exhaled and stepped back. Search the barn, he ordered. Margaret's pulse slammed in her ears. There's nothing there but hay and hens. We'll see. She followed as they crossed the yard, her mind racing. If they lifted the wrong plank, if they even glanced too long at the floor. Inside the barn, one soldier kicked over a bucket, another poked at the hay with a pitchfork. Margaret's heart stopped each time the metal prongs sank into the straw. The captain watched her. "You look nervous." "I'm cold," she said. He took a step closer. "No, that's not cold. That's guilt." The soldier nearest the hidden plank paused. "Captain," he said, pointing at the floor, "something's been moved here." Margaret forced herself to laugh. "Rats. I clean often." The captain crouched, running his gloved hand over the boards. For a moment, Margaret thought it was over. Then, from the corner of the barn, a sharp cry echoed. One of the hens flapped wildly, scattering feathers into the air. The captain turned his head, distracted by the commotion. "Control that bird!" As the soldiers chased it, Margaret stepped forward, blocking his view. "You've searched enough," she said, "so you won't find your ghost here." He straightened, brushing off his gloves. "Perhaps." He gave her one last look, cold and hard. "But remember this, Mrs. MacLeod. Mercy is often mistaken for guilt. Don't make me regret offering it." When they left, she waited until the sound of hooves disappeared over the hill before she dropped to her knees, pulling up the plank. Thomas climbed out, his face streaked with dirt. "They nearly found you," she said, her voice shaking. "But they didn't," he said. "Because of you." "I don't want your gratitude," she snapped. "I want you gone." He nodded slowly. "I'll leave when night falls." "You'll leave now." He looked toward the door. "If I go now, they'll see me. I'd lead them straight back to you." Margaret turned away, gripping the edge of a post. "Why won't you just tell me the truth? Who are you to make enemies like that?" "I told you," he said. "A man born into a name he didn't ask for." She spun to face him. "That name, does it have anything to do with this?" She pulled the golden emblem from her pocket and threw it at his feet. He froze, staring at it. "Where did you get that?" "From your cloak, the night you came." His jaw tightened. He bent to pick it up, closing his hand around it. "You should have burned it." "Then tell me what it means," she said. He met her eyes. "It means I can't stay." "That's no answer. It's the only one that will keep you safe." She glared at him, anger mixing with fear. "You've brought danger to my door, and now you think you can just walk away?" He nodded. "If I stay, they'll destroy everything you have left. And if you go, they'll still come. They think I'm hiding you." Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. "Then I'll go tonight. Once darkness falls, I'll head for the hills. You'll never see me again." The finality in his voice silenced her. She looked at him, this stranger who had brought fear into her home, but also a strange, unspoken warmth she couldn't explain. "Fine," she said at last, "but you'll eat first. A man shouldn't face the snow on an empty stomach." He smiled faintly. "You've got a stubborn heart. Someone has to," she said. That evening, the sky burned red over the frozen hills. Margaret cooked what little was left, a bit of broth, some bread, and they ate in silence. Ian sat between them, asking questions neither could answer. When the boy fell asleep, she walked Thomas to the door. "You should take the back path," she said. "It leads to the ridge." He nodded. "Thank you. For everything." "Don't thank me. Just don't die out there." He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. "If I live, I'll come back when it's safe. Don't make promises," she whispered. "They don't survive the winter." His grip lingered a moment before he stepped into the cold. The wind swallowed him, and soon the night claimed his shadow. Margaret shut the door and leaned against it, the house suddenly too quiet. The flames flickered low, and she felt the weight of the empty room settle over her. Hours passed. She tended the fire, watched her son sleep, and tried not to think of the man walking alone through the snow. When dawn broke, she found the emblem on the table, the one he'd taken with him. It lay beside a folded scrap of cloth, a few words scrawled in a steady hand. "For your kindness." She pressed the emblem to her chest, unsure whether to curse or pray. Outside, the world was still white and silent. Then, faintly, she heard the distant sound of hooves again. By the time she reached the window, dark figures were riding through the valley once more, searching, relentless, moving toward her home. And this time, the captain was at their head. The sound of hooves shattered the fragile calm of morning. Margaret froze halfway through packing flour into a sack, the spoon trembling in her hand. Ian sat at the table with his porridge untouched, his small face pale. "They're back," she whispered. He looked up at her, wide-eyed. "The bad men." "Go upstairs, Ian, quickly now." She waited until she heard his steps on the ladder before moving to the window. The riders came in a dark line through the snow, steam rising from their horses. Thomas's tracks were long gone, wiped clean by the night wind, but fear coiled in her chest all the same. The knock came hard and fast. She opened the door just enough to see the captain's face. "You again," she said coldly. He smiled thinly. "A pleasure as always. May I come in?" "You never ask, only push." "Then why change the habit now?" He brushed past her before she could protest, his boots leaving streaks of mud across the floor. "You've had a quiet week, Mrs. MacLeod. Suspiciously quiet." "Perhaps peace is what God allows those who mind their own business," she said. He laughed. "And yet you keep catching my attention." He turned, scanning the small cottage with a predator's calm. "We found a man's body not far from here last night. Thought you might know something." Her throat tightened. "A body, half buried in snow by the creek. Stab wound. You've seen no strangers?" "No one." He watched her too closely. "Strange. We found boot prints heading north just beyond your fence. Hunters passed through these woods. Not in a storm like the one we had," he said, "but maybe you're right." He leaned against the table, eyes flicking to the bowl of porridge. "Where's your boy?" "Sleeping," she said. The captain smiled again, that same thin, knowing smile. "Let him rest. The innocent shouldn't see what war leaves behind." "What do you mean?" He straightened, adjusting his gloves. "Orders have changed. We're no longer searching for a fugitive. The Crown has declared open bounty. Anyone caught aiding the man called Thomas Stewart will hang beside him." Margaret went cold. "Thomas Stewart?" "That's his name. Son of a duke. Some call him a rebel, others a rightful heir. I call him Trouble." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "If he came through here again, I'd advise you to remember which side you're on." She forced her voice to stay even. "I have no sides, Captain. I have a child." He studied her face, then gave a slow nod. "You're smarter than most." He left as abruptly as he came. The moment the door shut, Margaret's knees nearly gave out. She gripped the table, trying to steady her breath. Thomas Stewart. So that was the name he had hidden behind silence. When she finally climbed to the loft, Ian was sitting by the window, hugging his knees. "Did they hurt you, Mama?" "No," she said softly, "but we must be careful now. Very careful. Is the man coming back?" She hesitated. "I don't know." Days passed without word. The soldiers searched other farms, then vanished down the valley. Margaret tried to live as before, but every shadow felt heavier. She repaired the roof, mended clothes, and waited for the snow to melt. Yet at night she still saw Thomas's face, his eyes when he promised to return. A week later she went down to the stream for water. The sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in months. As she bent to fill the bucket, she heard footsteps behind her. "Mrs. MacLeod." The voice made her spin. Thomas stood at the edge of the trees, thinner, paler, but alive. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed. "They're still searching." "I know," he said, "but I couldn't leave without explaining." She looked around nervously. "If they see you—" "They won't. I've watched the road. It's clear." He stepped closer. "Please, hear me out." She stared at him, torn between anger and relief. "You lied to me." "I hid the truth. That's the same thing." He sighed. "When you found me, I was already being hunted. Not for treason, but for a truth the Crown wants buried. My father, he was the Duke of Inverness, loyal to the old king. When he died, his enemies accused me of conspiring with rebels. I fled to save what was left of my family's honor. And now? Now I'm the last of that line. If they catch me, they'll make an example of me." Margaret stared at him, her anger dimming under the weight of his words. "You said you had no name, no past." He gave a sad smile. "I wanted to believe that too." She turned away, her hands shaking. "You shouldn't have come back. They'll kill you, and if they find you here, they'll kill us too." "I won't stay," he said. "I came to ask for something." "What?" "Forgiveness." Her eyes met his. "Forgiveness doesn't erase danger." "No," he said softly, but it gives me courage to face it." There was something in his voice that made her chest ache. He looked older now, worn by the road, but there was gentleness in his eyes, the kind that no crown or exile could destroy. "You should go north," she said quietly. "There are safe places beyond the locks. People loyal to your name. I can't hide forever." "Then what will you do?" "Return," he said simply. "Face the men who branded me traitor. That's suicide." "It's justice," he said, "and I can't ask you to believe in a coward." "You think I care about justice?" she snapped. "I care about staying alive. I care about my boy." He nodded. "That's why I'll leave tonight." The words struck her harder than she expected. "You're leaving again?" "I must." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. "Then at least eat first." He smiled faintly. "You and your food. Even now you think of others." "Someone has to," she said again, repeating the same words from the night he'd first left. That evening he helped her gather wood behind the cottage. They worked in silence until he said, "I never thanked you for saving me. You can thank me by not getting caught." He laughed softly. "You speak like a soldier. I speak like a woman tired of burying good men." They carried the wood inside. Ian peeked from behind the table, his eyes lighting up when he saw Thomas. "You came back. Only for a short while, lad," Thomas said, kneeling to meet his gaze. "You've grown taller." Ian grinned. "Mama says I'll be taller than the church steeple one day. Then I'll have to come back and see it for myself." Margaret looked away, her throat tight. The boy didn't understand that promises were fragile things in a world ruled by soldiers. When Ian finally went to bed, Thomas stood by the door, fastening his cloak. "When this ends," he said, "I'll come back for you both. I swear it." She folded her arms. "You've already given too many oaths. This one I'll keep." He opened the door and the cold wind rushed in. Snowflakes caught in his hair, glinting in the firelight. "Thomas," she said suddenly, "if you die—" He turned. "Then remember me kindly." "Don't ask for kindness," she said, her voice breaking. "Ask for mercy." He smiled, then was gone. Margaret stood in the doorway long after his figure disappeared into the night. The next morning she woke to distant shouting. Smoke rose from the far ridge, black against the pale sky. She ran outside, her heart pounding. A neighbor was riding hard down the road, his horse lathered with sweat. "Margaret," he shouted, "the soldiers, they've found him, north of the creek. They're bringing his body to the village." Her vision swam. "His body?" The man nodded grimly. "The fugitive's dead. They'll hang the traitor's insignia on the gate as warning." She stood there, frozen in the snow. Ian tugged at her sleeve, his small voice trembling. "Mama, is the man coming back?" She looked down at him, unable to speak. The boy waited for an answer she couldn't give. That night, she sat alone by the fire, turning the golden emblem in her hands. It glowed faintly in the light, a cruel reminder of what mercy had cost her. She whispered his name once, barely a breath. Outside, the wind carried the sound of horses again, closer, urgent, breaking the silence of grief. Ian ran to her side. "Mama, someone's coming." She rose slowly, her heart twisting. Through the frost-covered window, a single rider appeared, struggling to stay upright. His horse stumbled to a stop before the cottage. Margaret's breath caught when she saw the face beneath the hood. Thomas was alive, barely conscious and bleeding into the snow. Margaret threw open the door before the horse had even stopped moving. The animal was trembling, its flanks slick with sweat, and Thomas was barely holding to the reins. His head drooped, his face pale and bloodless. "Thomas!" she cried. She reached up just in time to catch him as he slid from the saddle. His weight nearly pulled her down, but she managed to drag him inside, shouting for Ian. "Bring blankets, quickly!" The boy ran, tripping over the rug, and came back with an old quilt. Margaret spread it near the fire, easing Thomas down. His breath came in shallow gasps, his cloak torn, his shoulders soaked through with crimson. "Not again," she muttered. "You promised not to die." He managed a weak smile. "I tried to keep it." "Save your words," she said, tearing the fabric away from the wound. "What happened?" "They found me north of the creek," he said between breaths. "One of them recognized me. I made it to the riverbank before they lost me in the fog." "Were you followed?" "I don't know." She pressed a cloth to his wound, wincing at the heat beneath her hand. "You'll bleed to death if I can't stop this." He caught her wrist. You should have let me fall at the door. Don't say that, she said sharply. Not in front of my son. Ian stood nearby, his eyes huge. Is he dying, Mama? No, she said firmly, though her voice trembled. He's just hurt. Thomas tried to speak, but she silenced him with a look. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with boiled water and bandaging it tight. When she was done, he was shivering, but still breathing. Hours passed before he spoke again. You shouldn't have helped me. They'll come for you next. I've already chosen my side, she said. Don't make me regret it. He opened his eyes, faint amusement flickering there. You're braver than most soldiers I've met. I'm a mother, she said. That's worse. She tried to smile, but fear crept up her spine. She could hear faint echoes outside. Voices, maybe the wind, maybe not. She checked the window. Nothing but snow. Thomas, she whispered, if they're still searching, you can't stay here. He struggled to sit. I'll leave before sunrise. You won't even make it to the fence in this state. I have to. No, you don't. He stared at her, the firelight catching his face. You don't understand. If they find me here, they'll burn this house and hang your name beside mine. She shook her head. I won't let them take you again. Margaret, no! Her voice cracked. You came here once half dead, and I turned you away in fear. I won't do it again. The words hung between them, fierce and desperate. Thomas sank back, defeated. Then we need a plan. She nodded, pacing the room. The soldiers will return by morning. They'll search again. We can't fight them. I can distract them. And die for it? If I stay, you die with me. She stopped pacing and faced him. Then we leave. Tonight. He blinked. Leave? There's an old hunting path through the glen. It's rough, but it leads to the high ridges. They won't follow us there. He looked at her like she'd gone mad. You can't bring a child into the mountains in winter. I've done worse to survive, she said, and I won't wait for the flames. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, but if they catch us... They won't. She moved quickly, packing what little food remained. Bread, dried meat, a flask of water. Ian fetched his wooden horse and tucked it into his coat. Are we going on an adventure, Mama? Yes, she said softly. An adventure. They wrapped themselves in cloaks and stepped into the night. The air was knife-cold, the moon hidden behind clouds. Thomas leaned on her shoulder, his steps unsteady, but he refused to stop. They crossed the frozen stream, following the narrow trail that wound between dark trees. Snow fell silently, covering their tracks almost as fast as they made them. Keep close, she whispered to Ian. I'm not afraid, he said, though his voice trembled. Thomas glanced down at him. You're a brave lad. Like you? Thomas smiled faintly. Braver. They walked for what felt like hours. The forest opened into a small clearing where the ruins of an old stone chapel stood half buried in snow. Margaret stopped. We can rest here. Inside, the walls still stood, though the roof had long since fallen. Moonlight poured through the gaps. Thomas sank onto a fallen beam, breathing hard. I'm slowing you down, he said. You're alive. That's enough. She knelt beside him, checking his bandage. Blood had seeped through again. You'll need more than my hands can give. He caught her arm gently. You shouldn't have come. Stop saying that, she said. You think I could watch them hang you and go back to baking bread like nothing happened? He stared at her, a flicker of pain and something else passing through his eyes. You'd risk everything for a man you barely know. I know enough, she said. Silence settled between them. Ian was already asleep, curled up beside a pile of straw. Margaret sat beside the fire she'd managed to build with damp wood, staring at the flames. Thomas's voice broke the quiet. When I was a boy, my father told me the Highlands never forget. He said every kindness here is a debt that lives for generations. She looked at him. And what debt do you think you owe me? He smiled weakly. One I'll never repay. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the harsh lines of exhaustion. She saw not a fugitive now, but a man who had lost everything, title, home, peace, and still found the strength to keep moving. You should sleep, she whispered. So should you. I'll keep watch. Margaret, he said, his voice barely a breath. If I don't make it to the ridge, you will. Promise me you'll take Ian and go north. There are loyal families near Inverness. Show them this. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small ring set with a red stone. "They'll help you." She took it reluctantly. "You'll be the one to give it to them." He smiled again, but his eyes drifted shut. For a while, the only sound was the wind through the cracks. Margaret sat still, her mind racing with every possible danger. She almost didn't hear it at first, the faint crunch of snow outside the chapel. Her head snapped up. Another sound followed. Voices, muffled but close. She reached for Thomas's shoulder and shook him. "Wake up." He stirred, blinking. "What is it?" "Riders." His hand went instinctively to his side where a weapon would have hung, but he had none. "How many?" "I don't know, but they're near." He stood, swaying. "We can't run. They'll see us." "Then we hide." She grabbed Ian, wrapping him in her cloak, and pushed him toward the far wall where a collapsed section formed a shallow recess. Thomas crouched beside them, his breath harsh and uneven. The voices grew louder. Boots crunched on the snow just outside the chapel. "Tracks end here," someone said. "Search the ruins." Margaret held Ian close, pressing a hand over his mouth. Thomas reached for the dagger at his belt, a small blade, more ceremonial than useful. She caught his hand. "Don't," she mouthed. He hesitated, then nodded. Light flickered through the cracks as a soldier's torch swept the walls. The boots came closer, echoing against the stone. "Nothing here," another voice called. "Just rubble." "Check the far side," the captain's voice ordered. Margaret's heart pounded. The torchlight passed inches from their hiding place, then moved away. The men muttered among themselves. "There's a broken fence down the hill," one said. "Maybe they went that way." The footsteps faded slowly, then vanished altogether. Margaret didn't move until the wind filled the silence again. Then she exhaled shakily, her whole body trembling. Thomas looked at her, whispering, "You saved us again." "Not yet," she said. "They'll come back at dawn." He nodded, grim. "Then we leave before sunrise." She glanced at him, at the blood soaking through his sleeve, and felt the weight of their choices settle like the cold around them. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, erasing every trace of their footprints. When the first light touched the horizon, Margaret packed their things. Thomas stood at the doorway, his hand gripping the crumbling stone. "We'll reach the ridge by midday," he said. She looked up at him, exhaustion written across her face. "And after that?" He met her gaze. "After that, we see if the world will still have us." She took Ian's hand, ready to move. But before she could take a step, a faint metallic sound echoed from the trees, a sword being drawn, followed by the low murmur of men's voices closing in from both sides. The sound came again, steel against steel, faint but close. Thomas froze at the doorway, every muscle tightening. Margaret grabbed Ian's hand, pulling him back from the open light. "They've found us," she whispered. Thomas glanced toward the tree line. "They're circling. 3, maybe 4 riders." Her voice caught. "What do we do?" "We move fast and quiet." He reached for her arm. "There's a ravine behind the chapel. If we follow the stream, it'll hide our tracks. And if they see us, then we pray they're poor shots," he said grimly. She didn't argue. They slipped out the back of the ruins, the snow crunching under their boots. Thomas kept Ian between them, one hand gripping the boy's shoulder as they ran down the narrow slope. The sound of voices carried on the wind, growing sharper. "There, by the trees!" someone shouted. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas shoved her forward. "Run!" They plunged into the ravine, half sliding, half falling. Ian whimpered, clutching her skirt, but she didn't stop. The cold air burned her lungs. Thomas stumbled once, catching himself on a rock, blood darkening the snow behind him. When they reached the bottom, the stream twisted ahead, a narrow ribbon of frozen water glinting like glass. Thomas knelt, his breath ragged. "If we stay low, they'll lose sight of us." Margaret crouched beside him. "You can't keep running like this." He gave her a faint smile. "You haven't met Highland stubbornness yet." They moved along the frozen stream, the trees closing in above them. The shouts behind faded, replaced by the muffled thud of hooves. For a moment it seemed they might have escaped. Then came the whistle of an arrow, slicing through the air and striking a tree beside Margaret's head. She gasped. "They're shooting at us!" Thomas grabbed her arm. "Keep moving!" They reached a bend in the ravine where a fallen pine formed a natural bridge. Thomas stopped beneath it. "We'll climb up here. They'll think we followed the stream." Margaret hesitated. Ian can't climb that. I'll lift him, Thomas said. Go first. She scrambled up the trunk, gripping the rough bark. Snow fell from the branches with every move. Below, Thomas lifted Ian, pushing him toward her waiting hands. She pulled the boy up, just as another shout echoed through the ravine. Thomas climbed last, his wound bleeding freely now. He slipped once but caught himself. Margaret reached down and caught his wrist, her heart hammering. "Don't you dare fall now." He looked up, breathless. "I wasn't planning to." Once they reached the ridge above, they crouched behind a cluster of rocks. The soldiers rode below, their torches glowing dim through the mist. One stopped, pointing at the frozen stream. "Tracks end here, Captain." "They're close," the captain's voice growled. "Fan out!" Thomas pressed a finger to his lips. The three of them stayed silent as the riders spread apart, their torches flickering between the trees. After several minutes, the sound of hooves faded again. Thomas leaned back against the rocks, closing his eyes. Margaret turned to him. "You're bleeding too much." "It'll stop," he muttered. "It won't if you die first." She tore a strip from her cloak and pressed it to his shoulder. He winced, but didn't pull away. "You should have left me when you had the chance." "I don't abandon people," she said. "Not anymore." He opened his eyes and met hers. "You're not the one who needs saving anymore, are you?" She ignored the question. "We can rest a few minutes, then keep moving. If we reach the northern ridge, we can see the next valley." He nodded, though his hands trembled. "You're the one giving orders now." "I've had practice," she said. Ian tugged her sleeve. "Mama, I'm cold." She wrapped her arm around him. "Just a little longer, love. We'll find a place to build a fire soon." Thomas's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "There's an old shepherd's hut near the ridge. If it's still standing, we can reach it before dusk." They set off again, climbing through the thinning trees. The snow was softer here, deeper, and each step felt heavier. The world seemed to narrow to the crunch of boots, the rasp of breath, and the occasional crack of a distant branch. When they finally reached the ridge, Margaret saw it, a small hut, half collapsed but still standing. Smoke stains blackened its stones. She hurried ahead, pushing open the creaking door. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. There was a hearth, cold and empty, and a few broken tools in the corner. Thomas sank onto the floor, his strength gone. She built a fire quickly, feeding it dry twigs and bits of bark. The flame caught, small but steady. Ian huddled close, his face lit orange by the glow. Thomas watched her quietly. "You move like someone who's done this 100 times. Living here teaches you to expect the worst," she said. He smiled faintly. "You don't seem afraid anymore." "Oh, I'm terrified," she said. "I just don't have time to show it." He laughed softly, then winced at the pain. "You should have been born a chieftain's daughter." "I was born a farmer's wife," she said, pulling the bandage tighter. "And look how that turned out." The humor faded from his face. "What happened to him?" "My husband." She hesitated. "Culloden." He believed he was fighting for a better world. The world disagreed. Thomas looked at the fire. "War makes fools of men who dream, and widows of women who love them," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You deserve better than this." She looked at him sharply. "Don't start that." "That what?" "The talk of what I deserve. I don't need pity." "It's not pity," he said. "It's truth. Truth doesn't fill a pot or warm a bed." "Sometimes it does," he said softly. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She turned back to the fire. "Rest now. You need your strength." He nodded, settling back against the wall. The firelight flickered over his face, softening the hard lines. For the first time he looked at peace. Hours passed. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters. Margaret kept watch by the fire while Ian slept curled in her lap. She was almost dozing when a faint sound broke through the storm, a whistle short and sharp. Thomas's eyes opened instantly. "That's no wind." He got to his feet, unsteady but alert. "They've found the horses. They'll track us here." Margaret stood, her heart racing. "How many?" "Too many." She grabbed Ian's hand. "We have to go." Thomas shook his head. "If we run now, they'll see the smoke from the fire. They'll follow the trail. I'll hold them off." "You can barely stand." "I don't need to stand long." "No," her voice broke. "You can't fight them alone." He looked at her with something between sadness and resolve. You said once you don't abandon people. Let me prove I don't either. Margaret's throat tightened. You'll die. Maybe, he said, but you'll live. She stared at him, searching for words that wouldn't come. Ian clung to her, whispering, Mama. She forced herself to speak. If you do this, it's for nothing. They'll hunt me anyway. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. Not if they believe I left you behind. I'll draw them away. Before she could answer, the door shook under a heavy blow. A shout followed, muffled by the wind. Thomas turned toward her, eyes steady. Take the back path through the pines. It leads north. Don't stop until you reach the loch. Thomas, he took her hand and pressed something into it, the same red stone ring he'd given her before. Keep it this time. The door shuddered again. The hinges screamed. He met her gaze one last time. Go, Margaret. She wanted to argue, to refuse, but the look in his eyes silenced her. She grabbed Ian and ran to the back of the hut. The wind struck her face as she pushed through the broken boards into the trees beyond. Behind her she heard Thomas's voice, strong, defiant. Here! I'm here! The soldiers shouted in answer, boots crunching through the snow, torches flashing like angry stars. Margaret ran harder, dragging Ian through the drifts, branches slashing at her cloak. She didn't look back until the sound of steel and shouts filled the air. Then, just for an instant, she saw light behind the trees, the hut ablaze, flames leaping into the night. Ian began to cry. Mama, where's Thomas? She couldn't answer. The fire roared higher, sparks flying into the dark sky, and then over the wind came one last sound, the echo of hooves breaking away from the burning hut, racing toward the open valley. Margaret ran until her legs burned and her breath tore from her chest. The forest seemed endless, branches clawing at her cloak, snow blinding her eyes. Ian clung to her hand, stumbling to keep up. Behind them the night glowed faintly orange with fire. The hut was gone. So was Thomas. Keep going, she whispered. Don't look back. Ian sobbed softly but obeyed. They pushed through the trees until the flames were only a memory, and the silence returned, heavy and strange. At last, when her body refused to take another step, Margaret stopped beside a frozen brook. The boy collapsed against her, shaking. Are we safe now? He asked. She looked around at the still white woods. For now, she said. The cold cut through her like knives. She gathered branches with trembling hands, trying to light a small fire with the flint she carried. The spark caught, weak but steady. They huddled together for warmth. Margaret stared into the fire, but all she saw was the blaze consuming the hut. She could still hear the echo of Thomas's voice shouting to draw the soldiers away. Every heartbeat was a question she didn't dare answer. When dawn came, the storm had quieted. She stood, numb and hollow, and looked north. The ridge rose in the distance, marking the path to Inverness. The thought of going there alone made her stomach twist, but she remembered the ring in her pocket, the red stone catching faint light through her fingers. She closed her hand around it. Come on, Ian, she said. We have to move. They walked until her feet ached. The sky stayed grey, the land silent. Every now and then she thought she heard the distant sound of hooves and froze, but it was only wind against the rocks. By midday, they reached the edge of a valley where a narrow road wound toward the village below. Smoke curled from chimneys. Life continued, unaware of what had burned in the hills. Margaret hesitated at the sight. She couldn't go back to her own cottage. The soldiers had surely searched it by now, but she needed shelter. Will we see him again? Ian asked suddenly. She didn't answer. At the edge of the road, an old farmer spotted them and waved. Good God, Margaret MacLeod, I thought you'd frozen up there. She forced a faint smile. Just lost my way. The man frowned. There's been trouble. Soldiers everywhere. They say the king's men fought a rebel last night, burned him out near the ridge. Her stomach clenched. A rebel? That's what they're saying. The captain himself brought the news. He's boasting about the kill. Her lips parted, but no words came. The man lowered his voice. Stay away from them, lass. They're questioning anyone who offered shelter. It's not safe. I'll remember that, she said. He pointed toward the church at the far end of the village. Father Callum's been taking in the displaced. He won't turn you away. Thank you, she murmured. Margaret led Ian down the road. The villagers glanced their way, whispering, but she kept her eyes forward. The church door was open, warm light spilling out. Inside, the priest looked up from a group of children huddled by the fire. "Margaret," he said gently, "you're safe, thank the Lord." She nodded, barely able to speak. "I need a place for the night." "Of course." He led them to a small corner near the hearth. "Rest here. I'll find you something hot to eat." She sat with Ian, who leaned against her shoulder, half asleep. The warmth made her dizzy. For a moment she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Father Callum was sitting across from her, studying her face. "You've seen him, haven't you?" She stiffened. "Who?" "The man they're hunting." Her fingers tightened around the ring in her pocket. "I don't know what you mean." He lowered his voice. "You're a terrible liar, child. I've known you since you were a girl. You came from the hills the same night they say he was killed." She met his gaze. "Then you know I have nothing to confess." He sighed. "You're brave, Margaret. But bravery can turn to martyrdom if you're not careful. Keep your head low." "I intend to." He nodded slowly, then stood. "There's talk that the crown means to restore the lands of Inverness. That's why they were hunting him. If what people whisper is true, he wasn't a rebel at all." Her heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "Some claim he was the Duke's rightful son, exiled to keep him from claiming the throne. If that's true, his death may not end the matter." Margaret's throat went dry. "He's not dead." The priest looked at her sharply. "Margaret, I know he's not," she said, her voice fierce and low. "He can't be." Father Callum didn't argue, only crossed himself and murmured, "Then pray you're right." That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her flinch. Ian slept beside her, his small hand curled around hers. She stared at the church window where moonlight painted a pale square on the floor. Near dawn, footsteps sounded at the door. The hinges creaked. Margaret sat up, ready to flee, but it was only Father Callum carrying a letter. "A rider came just before sunrise," he whispered. "Said this was for you." "For me?" He nodded. He was cloaked, spoke little. Left as soon as he handed it over. She took the folded parchment. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a single line written in a hand she knew too well. "The lion still stands. Wait for the messenger." Her breath caught. "Bad news?" the priest asked. "No," she said softly. "Hope." For the first time in days, she felt warmth that didn't come from the fire. By afternoon, soldiers arrived in the village. Margaret stayed in the church, her hood pulled low. The captain entered, his boots echoing against the stone. His eyes swept the room, sharp and calculating. "Father," he said, "we're looking for a woman and child who fled the glen last night. A widow. MacLeod." The priest's expression didn't change. "There are many MacLeods. This one's been keeping company with a traitor. I shelter those in need, Captain. I don't check their politics first." The captain's mouth twisted. "If she's here, you'll hand her over." "She's not." The captain studied him a moment longer, then turned and left. When the door closed, the priest exhaled. "You need to go, Margaret, tonight." "Go where?" "There's a safe road north, through the woods. If he's alive, that's where he'll go. Take the letter as proof. Someone will be watching." She nodded, gathering what little she had. Ian clung to her cloak, sleepy and frightened. "Are we leaving again?" "Yes, love. Just for a while." That night, under cover of darkness, they slipped from the church. The village slept, unaware. The snow was falling again, soft and relentless. Margaret held Ian close, following the path the priest described. Hours passed. The forest opened to reveal a frozen lake shining faintly under the moon. On the far side, a single lantern burned. Margaret stopped, her heart racing. "Do you see that light?" Ian nodded. "Is it him?" "I don't know." They crossed the ice carefully, the surface creaking beneath their boots. As they neared the far bank, a figure stepped from the shadows. A man cloaked in grey, his hood drawn low. "Margaret MacLeod?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "Who are you?" "A friend of the rightful heir." Her heart leapt. "Thomas, is he alive?" The man gave a faint smile. "Alive and waiting, but we must move quickly. The king's men are searching the southern valleys." "Where is he?" "Safe for now. He sent this." The stranger handed her a small silver brooch, shaped like the lion crest. Margaret stared at it, her throat tight. "When can I see him?" "Soon. the man said. "But first we must reach the northern pass. There's a convoy headed for the coast. If we're caught before then—" A sudden shout cut him off. Horses thundered on the far shore, torches flaring against the night. The captain's voice carried across the ice. "There they are. Don't let them reach the woods." The messenger turned. "Run!" Margaret grabbed Ian's hand. The brooch clutched in her fist and sprinted toward the tree line. The ice cracked beneath their feet, the sound echoing like thunder. Arrows hissed past, one striking the snow beside her. She didn't look back. The messenger drew a sword and turned to face the riders. The last thing she heard before the darkness of the forest swallowed them was his shout, "For the air!" and the clash of steel meeting steel. Margaret didn't stop running until her lungs felt like fire. The forest swallowed the light of the torches behind her, and still she ran, dragging Ian through the snow. Branches whipped at her face, the wind stealing her breath. Somewhere behind them, men shouted orders and horses screamed. "Keep moving," she gasped. "Don't stop." Ian stumbled, his boots catching on a root. She lifted him into her arms and kept going until the trees opened into a narrow clearing. The moon broke through the clouds, silvering the frozen ground. She set the boy down gently. "Are they gone?" he whispered. "Not yet," she said, "but they will be." He looked at her, frightened but trusting. "Will the man find us again? The one with the sword? If he's as loyal as he claims," she said, "he'll make sure of it." The sound of hooves grew distant, fading toward the lake. Margaret listened, waiting until silence returned. Then she crouched beside Ian. "We'll go north until we find a road. Stay close." They moved through the forest for hours, following faint animal paths. The snow lightened as the sky began to turn pale grey. Just as the first light of morning crept through the trees, Margaret spotted smoke in the distance, thin, curling, human. She hesitated. It could be soldiers. It could also be the only fire for miles. Ian tugged her cloak. "Mama, I'm hungry." She brushed his cheek. "We'll find food soon." They approached cautiously, crouching behind a line of rocks. In a small clearing stood a cottage, simple but cared for. A woman was chopping wood by the door, her breath forming clouds in the air. She looked no older than Margaret. Margaret stepped forward. "Good morning," she called softly. The woman turned, startled. Her eyes widened. "God above, you're half frozen. Come inside." Margaret hesitated. "We don't want to bring trouble." "Nonsense. Trouble finds us all. Come." Inside, the warmth nearly made Margaret weep. The woman led them to the fire where a pot simmered. "I'm Elspeth," she said, ladling broth into a bowl. "You're travellers, I take it?" "Something like that," Margaret replied. Elspeth handed her the bowl. "Eat first, explain later." Margaret watched Ian devour the soup, grateful for the brief peace, but she couldn't ignore the ache of fear in her chest. "You live alone?" "My husband's with the herders near Inverness," Elspeth said. "I stay here to tend the lambs. Why should I be expecting company?" Margaret hesitated. "There may be soldiers nearby. They're hunting a man, a nobleman." Elspeth raised an eyebrow. "You mean the ghost they say died in the glen? Every traveller talks about him. Half the folk think he's the devil himself." "He's not dead," Margaret said quietly. Elspeth studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Then you're part of that story, aren't you?" Margaret didn't answer. Elspeth smiled faintly. "Don't worry, I'm not the gossiping kind. Eat, rest, and when the storm clears, you'll decide what comes next." Margaret wanted to believe her. She and Ian stayed by the fire while Elspeth tended to her chores. For the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to breathe. By dusk, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Elspeth frowned. "You can stay tonight. It's too dangerous to travel." Margaret nodded, her body already heavy with exhaustion. Later, when Ian was asleep on a pile of blankets, Margaret sat by the hearth, turning the silver brooch in her hands. Elspeth poured 2 cups of tea and sat beside her. "That's a fine piece," she said. "Looks royal." "It belonged to a man I once sheltered," Margaret said. Elspeth leaned closer. "The same man the soldiers are after?" "Yes. And what is he to you?" Margaret looked into the fire. "A man who risked his life to save mine." Elspeth studied her for a long moment. "Then he must mean something." "He means more than I should admit," Margaret said softly. Before Elspeth could reply, a knock came at the door, sharp, deliberate, too calm to be friendly. Elspeth froze. "That's no neighbour." Margaret grabbed Ian's hand and pulled him behind her. Elspeth opened the door just enough to see who stood outside. A man in a dark cloak bowed his head. "Peace, mistress. I bring word for Margaret MacLeod." Margaret's heart jumped. "Who are you?" He looked up. His face was lean, weathered, but kind. "A messenger from the north, Thomas Stewart, lives," Elspeth gasped. Margaret stepped forward. "Where is he?" "Safe. The soldiers believe him dead. He's gathered allies in Inverness. He sent me to fetch you." Margaret clutched the brooch to her chest. "He's alive," she whispered. The messenger nodded. "He said you would doubt it. I carry proof." He reached into his coat and pulled out the red stone ring Thomas had given her. She took it, her hands trembling. "Then he truly lives." "He waits for you at the citadel," the messenger said. "But you must leave at once. The captain's patrols ride this way." Elspeth grabbed her shawl. "You'll need supplies." "I'll pack what I can." Margaret turned to Ian. "We're going to see Thomas." The boy smiled sleepily. "I knew he wasn't dead." Within minutes, they were ready. The messenger led them into the night, the storm swirling around them. Elspeth waved from the doorway. "God guide you." They followed the narrow trail through the snow, the wind howling across the hills. The messenger walked ahead, his lantern swinging. "The road to Inverness is watched," he said. "We'll take the old pass. Few dare use it now." They travelled for hours, stopping only when the wind became too fierce to see. Under a cluster of pines, the messenger built a small fire. "Rest here," he said. "We'll reach the city by tomorrow evening." Margaret looked up through the branches at the faint glow of stars. Will he truly be safe there? "He's under the protection of men who owe him loyalty," the messenger said. "The council knows the truth of his birth now. They're preparing to restore his title." She stared at him, hardly daring to believe it. "Restore? You mean he will stand before them soon as heir to the throne of Scotland?" Her breath caught. "Then he'll need no more help from a widow in the hills." The messenger smiled faintly. "That's not what he told me. He said he owes his life and his soul to the woman who hid him when all others would have turned him away." Margaret turned her face from the fire. "Then he remembers too much." Ian, half asleep, mumbled, "Will he be king?" The messenger chuckled. "Perhaps one day, little one." They travelled again at dawn. The snow eased as they neared the lowlands. Roads widened and faint signs of life appeared, smoke from farms, distant bells, and the hum of the river thawing beneath the ice. By evening, the walls of Inverness rose before them, tall and grey against the fading sky. The messenger led them through the northern gate, exchanging quiet words with the guards. Margaret's heart pounded as they crossed the bridge. She hadn't seen such a place since her youth, the noise, the horses, the smell of bread and fire. It felt like another world. They stopped before a great stone hall. The messenger turned to her. "He's inside." Her throat tightened. "And what am I to say?" "Whatever you've kept in your heart," he said. He pushed open the door. Warmth and light poured out. At the far end of the hall, Thomas stood by the fire, dressed not as a fugitive but as a nobleman restored. His wounds were healed, his bearing straight. When he saw her, the calm in his eyes broke. "Margaret." She couldn't speak. He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. "You came. You're alive," she breathed. "Because of you," he said. "Because you believed when the world called me dead." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I thought I'd lost you." "You never did," he said softly. "Every step I took, I carried your courage with me." Ian tugged her sleeve. "Mama, he looks like a king." Thomas knelt before the boy, smiling. "I'm not one yet, but perhaps your mother will teach me how to deserve such faith." Margaret tried to laugh through her tears. "You're too grand for flattery now." He rose, still holding her hand. "There's no title high enough to make me forget what you gave me. A home, a reason to live. You saved more than a man, Margaret. You saved the heart of a kingdom." She looked at him, unsure if the world around her was real. "What will happen now? The council meets tomorrow. They've called me heir, but I will not take a throne built on fear. I'll rebuild it on mercy, yours." The firelight glowed between them. She saw in his eyes the same man who had once knocked on her door in the storm, half dead and desperate, now whole again, but no less human. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I told them I wouldn't begin my reign until I had one promise kept." "What promise?" He smiled faintly. That you'd let me find you. Before she could reply, the doors at the far end of the hall burst open. A guard ran in, breathless. "My lord, the Royal Council demands your presence at once. They're waiting for your declaration of succession." Thomas stood still, his hand still holding Margaret's. The guard's words hung in the air like cold steel. Around them the murmurs of courtiers rose, the flicker of torchlight throwing long shadows across the stone floor. He glanced at her, the warmth in his eyes dimming under the weight of duty. "They won't wait," he said quietly. Margaret drew a breath. "Then go. They've waited years for you to claim what's yours." "What's mine?" He looked down at their joined hands. "I'm not sure anymore. You were born for this, Thomas. Don't let my presence make you forget it." He smiled faintly, though the sadness in it betrayed him. "If you knew what they expect of me, you wouldn't say that. I don't care what they expect. You'll face them the way you faced everything else, with truth." He let her go reluctantly, his fingers lingering on hers. "Wait for me here." Margaret nodded, her chest tight as she watched him follow the guard down the long corridor toward the council chamber. The great doors closed behind him, and she was left alone with the crackle of the fire and the low hum of whispers from curious attendants who eyed her with barely concealed judgment. Ian climbed onto the bench beside her, swinging his legs. "Mama, are we staying here forever?" She smiled faintly. "Just until they decide what will happen." He frowned. "He's the king now, isn't he?" "Almost," she said softly. "But crowns are heavier than they look." An older servant approached her timidly. "Lady MacLeod?" "I'm no lady," Margaret replied. The woman smiled. "You will be, if the rumors are true." Margaret shook her head. "Rumors are wind. They change with the weather." The woman hesitated, then set a cup of warm wine in front of her. "He speaks highly of you, my lady. He told the council that without your kindness, there'd be no heir to the throne at all." Margaret looked down at the steaming cup, unsure how to answer. "Kindness isn't currency in palaces," she murmured, but she thanked the woman anyway. The hall grew quieter as night deepened. Hours passed before the doors opened again. Thomas emerged, the councillors behind him, men in heavy cloaks, their faces carved from years of politics. Margaret rose. One of the councillors, an older man with a stern mouth, stepped forward. "Mrs. MacLeod, His Grace has informed us of your assistance during his exile." She inclined her head. "I did only what anyone would do." The man's lips thinned. "Few would have risked the gallows for a stranger." "You have our gratitude." Her eyes flicked to Thomas. He stood silent, his jaw tight. Gratitude sounded too much like dismissal. Another councillor spoke. "His Grace has sworn to rebuild the crown's honour, but alliances must be restored. A marriage has been proposed with Lady Isabel of Perth, an arrangement that will strengthen the realm." The words hit Margaret like a blow. She looked at Thomas. He didn't move, but his eyes betrayed him. Pain, regret, conflict. The first councillor continued. "You understand, of course, that the future of Scotland requires stability above sentiment." Margaret forced her voice to remain steady. "I understand." Ian looked up at her. "Mama," she rested a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, love." Thomas finally spoke. "You speak as though the crown owns my heart as well as my name." "It owns both, Your Grace," the older man replied. "And Scotland owns you." Thomas's gaze shifted back to Margaret. "Then I suppose I'm already divided." The councillors exchanged uneasy looks. One bowed stiffly. "The people await your word tomorrow." "May wisdom guide you, my lord." They left the hall, their cloaks sweeping the floor. Silence settled again. Margaret stood motionless until the last echo of their footsteps faded. Thomas turned to her. "I didn't know they would say that. I swear it. I believe you," she said quietly. "But you don't owe me explanations." He stepped closer. "You think I'll marry that woman?" "I think you'll do what your people need." "And what of what I need?" "You're not allowed to think of that now." He gave a hollow laugh. "So that's it. The crown wins." "The crown didn't ask you to come to my door that night," she said. "You made that choice. You made this one too." He stared at her, breathing hard, torn between anger and something deeper. "If I lose you for this, Margaret—" "You won't lose me," she said softly. "You'll just carry me somewhere you can't see me." She reached up, touching his cheek. "You said you wanted to build a kingdom on mercy. Prove it, even if that mercy costs your happiness." His eyes glistened, but he didn't let the tears fall. "You make it sound easy." It's not. Nothing worth keeping ever is. A knock broke the moment. A young page entered, bowing low. Your Grace. The guards request instructions for the dawn procession. Thomas nodded without turning. I'll come soon. When the boy left, he looked back at Margaret. What will you do? I'll go home, she said. There's work to be done. A field doesn't plough itself. You can't mean to return to that valley. It's ashes now. Then I'll build again. He took a slow breath. You'd rather live among ghosts than stay here. I already live among ghosts, she said. Ian tugged her hand. Mama, can we go now? She nodded. Yes, love. Say good night to our friend. Thomas knelt to Ian's level. You'll take care of her for me, won't you? Ian nodded solemnly. I already do. Thomas smiled faintly and stood. Margaret pulled her cloak around her shoulders. He reached out once more, catching her hand. If the world were different, she stopped him, but it's not. Their eyes met one last time. Then she turned and walked away, Ian's small hand in hers. The great doors closed behind them, with a soft echo. Outside, the snow had started again, falling in slow, heavy flakes. The city was quiet. Margaret and Ian passed through the gate without question. No one stopped the widow who had saved a king. By the time they reached the northern road, dawn was breaking. She paused on a hill overlooking the valley, the castle rising far behind like a dream already fading. Ian yawned. Are we really going home, Mama? She nodded. Home is wherever we start again. He looked up at her. Will he come back? She smiled faintly. Kings don't come back, love. They wait for others to find them. The road stretched ahead, white and endless. She adjusted her cloak and kept walking. Days passed. The snow began to melt, and the first signs of spring touched the hills. Margaret rebuilt the cottage with the help of her neighbours. She worked until her hands bled, grateful for the exhaustion that left no room for thought. The people whispered about her, the woman who had saved the lost heir, the widow who had turned down a crown. She ignored them all. One evening, Father Callum rode up the path. I heard you were back, he said, dismounting. I didn't believe it until I saw it. Believe what you see, she said, handing him a cup of broth. He drank in silence, studying her. The new king announced his coronation this morning. They say he spoke of mercy, of rebuilding the highlands, of the people who carried him when he was nothing. He spoke of you. Margaret froze. Of me? I. Said a woman once gave him shelter when the world shut its doors. Said he learned more of kingship in her cottage than he ever did in a palace. Her throat tightened. Then he kept his promise. Father Callum nodded. He also sent this. He reached into his cloak and produced a small sealed letter. Delivered by a royal courier, I was told to give it to you personally. Margaret took it, her hands trembling. She opened it slowly. Inside the words were simple. The crown may claim my name, but you will always hold my heart. When peace comes, I will return to the only home I ever found. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. Father Callum smiled. Seems even kings can't outrun their hearts. Margaret glanced toward the fading sunset. He has his kingdom now. That's enough, the priest nodded. Maybe. But something tells me his story isn't finished. She looked down at Ian, who was chasing a lamb near the fence, his laughter echoing across the field. Neither is mine. For the first time in months, she felt no fear. The valley was quiet again, the world settling into peace. The wind carried only the scent of earth and new life, and far off, beyond the hills, a single rider paused at the crest of the road, watching the smoke from her chimney rise into the pale evening sky. The spring sun lay soft on the valley, turning the hills to gold. Margaret stood outside her cottage, her hands deep in the earth, planting the first shoots of barley. Ian played near the fence, chasing a lamb with a stick for a sword. It had been nearly 3 months since the letter came, and though she told herself not to hope, every time the wind shifted down the valley she still looked up. The sound came before she saw it, the distant rhythm of hooves, steady and sure. Margaret froze, her heart leaping. Ian heard it too and turned toward the road, his eyes wide. "Mama," he said, "there's a rider." She wiped her hands on her apron, shading her eyes against the light. A single figure appeared at the crest of the hill, the sun flashing off his cloak clasp, a lion's head gleaming red and gold. Her breath caught. He rode down slowly, the horse's hooves soft on the grass. When he reached the gate, he stopped, dismounted, and removed his gloves. He looked just as she remembered, perhaps thinner, perhaps wiser, but the same calm eyes that had once pleaded for shelter on a stormy night. Thomas smiled faintly. "I thought I'd find you here." Margaret's voice trembled. "You shouldn't have come." "I gave my word," he said. "Kings don't break their promises." She laughed softly, though her eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't say that word here. It doesn't belong in this valley." "Then neither do I," he said, stepping closer. "But I came anyway." She studied him, taking in the fine clothes that still couldn't hide the man beneath. "Your council will be looking for you." "They think I'm visiting the northern garrisons," he said. "Let them." Ian ran forward before she could stop him. "You came back," he shouted. Thomas lifted him easily, spinning him once before setting him down again. "I told you I would." "Are you a king now?" Ian asked. Thomas knelt, so their eyes met. "Something like that. But kings are only as good as the people who keep them honest." The boy grinned. "Mama does that all the time." Thomas laughed and looked up at her. "So she does." Margaret shook her head, fighting the smile tugging at her lips. "You risked your crown for this visit." "I risked nothing," he said quietly. "Everything worth having is here." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document sealed with red wax. "The council insisted I sign it before I left. It grants your family title to this land, yours and your sons. No tax, no feudal claim, it belongs to you forever." She stared at it, stunned. "You can't just give away royal land." "I can," he said. "It's one of the few privileges of my position." She took the parchment but didn't open it. "You shouldn't have done this. I wanted you to have a home no one could take from you again." Her throat tightened. "Why?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Because this place gave me mine." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred her hair and he reached up without thinking, brushing a stray strand from her cheek. She didn't pull away. "Thomas," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" He smiled gently. "Keeping another promise." "What promise?" "The one I made when I left this valley. The promise that I'd come back when it was over, not as a fugitive or a ghost, but as a man who finally knew where he belonged." She looked at him, her eyes bright. "And where is that?" He took her hand, the calluses of her fingers pressing against his. "Here, with you." She tried to speak, but her voice broke. "You have a country waiting for you. They'll expect you to marry someone with a crown, not a woman who digs in the dirt." He smiled, shaking his head. "The council made their choice. Now it's my turn." "Thomas." He didn't let her finish. "I'm tired of being what others demand. I've spent years fighting for a throne I never wanted, running from titles I didn't choose. But when I was here, with you, with Ian, I learned what it means to live. That's the only crown I care for now." She blinked back tears. "You don't know what you're saying." "Oh, I do." His voice softened. "Margaret MacLeod, I would trade every banner, every title, and every stone of that cold castle to spend my life beside you. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. Now I offer you the same. My name, my life, whatever I am." Her heart pounded. "You're asking me to be your queen." He shook his head. "No. I'm asking you to be my wife. The queen can wait." She stared at him, torn between disbelief and joy. "You can't mean it." "I do," he said simply. "Not as a command, not as a king, but as the man you once pulled out of the snow." For a long moment, all she could do was stare at him. Then she laughed through her tears. "You're impossible." "So are you," he said, smiling. Ian looked between them, confused. "Mama, is he staying?" Margaret looked down at her son, then back at Thomas. "I think he means to." Thomas nodded. "If you'll have me." She shook her head, half in wonder, half in surrender. "I must be mad." "Then we'll be mad together," he said. She hesitated only a heartbeat longer before she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He reached for her hand again, and she let him. "You're sure?" she whispered. He smiled. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The air seemed to still around them. She took a breath that trembled and said, "Then yes." Thomas's expression broke into the kind of smile she'd never seen on him before, unguarded, full of relief. "Then I'm home." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her lips, slow and tender, the kind of kiss that said everything words could not. She felt warmth flood through her, And for the first time since the war had taken her husband, she didn't feel alone. When they finally pulled apart, Ian was grinning. "Does this mean we're a family now?" Thomas laughed softly. "If your mother allows it." Margaret knelt beside Ian. "It means we're not alone anymore." The boy threw his arms around both of them. "Good. I like him." Thomas chuckled, wrapping an arm around them both. "Then I suppose I've passed the hardest test." They stood like that for a long while, the wind stirring the grass around them. The valley stretched wide and green, alive again. Later, when the sun dipped behind the hills, Margaret brought Thomas into the cottage. Nothing had changed. The stone walls, the wooden table, the faint scent of peat smoke. He smiled as he looked around. "It's exactly as I remember." "You sound disappointed," she teased. "Not disappointed," he said. "Grateful." She lit the lamp, its soft glow filling the room. "You can stay until the road's clear," she said. "The mountain passes are still dangerous." He smiled. "I think I'll stay a bit longer than that." They ate together, simple bread and soup, laughing when Ian told stories about the goats and the stubborn hens. Thomas listened with the patience of a man who'd fought wars and finally found something worth the peace. When Ian finally drifted off to sleep, Margaret stood by the fire, staring into the flames. Thomas came to her side. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "What will they say back in the city when they find their king gone?" "They'll understand soon enough," he said. "A kingdom can wait, but a heart that's found home shouldn't." She smiled faintly. "You speak like a poet now." He took her hands. "No, just a man who finally stopped running." They stood in silence, the firelight flickering between them. Outside, the night was calm, the world at rest. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring, simple, unadorned, its metal warm from his touch. "I had this made before I left the city," he said. "I didn't tell anyone why." She looked at it, her breath catching. "Thomas." He took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. "No court, no crown, no vows before witnesses. Just this promise. That wherever you are, I am too." Her eyes shone. "And if the world changes again," he smiled, "then we'll change with it." She pressed her forehead against his. "You're certain this is what you want?" He laughed softly. "For once in my life, I'm certain of everything." They kissed again, the fire crackling beside them, the wind soft against the windows. The world outside could wait. By morning, the valley was alive with birdsong. The villagers came with baskets and laughter, whispering at the sight of Thomas standing beside Margaret. The news spread quickly. A royal carriage had arrived from Inverness carrying Father Callum himself. The priest smiled broadly as he stepped down. "I knew you wouldn't stay apart forever," he said. "Shall we make it official then?" Thomas looked at Margaret. She nodded, laughing through her tears. The ceremony was simple, held under the oak tree beside the cottage. The people of the valley gathered, cheering when Father Callum spoke the final blessing. Ian stood proudly between them, holding both their hands. When the vows were spoken and Thomas kissed her once more, the crowd erupted in joy. Bells rang from the church down the hill, echoing through the glen. Margaret looked at Thomas, the man who had once arrived at her door, a broken stranger, now standing beside her as her husband, her equal, her home. He smiled, his voice low so only she could hear. "Do you see it now?" "What?" she whispered. "The kingdom I spoke of. It isn't built of stone or crowns, it's this. Your hand, your heart, your son's laughter. This is where I was meant to reign." She laughed softly, tears shining in her eyes. "Then may your reign last a lifetime." He leaned close, his lips near her ear. "It already has." The sun broke through the clouds, bathing them in light as the valley filled with cheers. Margaret closed her eyes, her hand in his, and for the first time since the storm that had brought him to her door, she felt completely, irrevocably home. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.